Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Weren't these speakers very passionate and very intelligent and very inspiring? Yes, they were. I know for me personally, I felt very inspired. As a filmmaker, I also felt deeply connected to the work that they presented because our work overlaps in a lot of different ways. And although they're not all documentary filmmakers, they're media and content creators who are using their voice and using their platform and their intelligence and their passion for social justice to create change and to build empathies where empathy is very much needed. And so, for me, as someone who has spent several years now working on documentary films that are intended to create empathy and intended to create social justice, particularly in areas around gender, race, and class, in addition to food justice issues with my previous film, Soul Food Junkies. I know firsthand how difficult it is to use media to create empathy. And you have to be very intentional and very strategic about how you are communicating to your audience, right? You have to be very thoughtful about how you present your information, how you frame the stories, how you get your audiences to feel, how do you get your audiences to think, how do you get your audiences to respond from an emotional level, not just an intellectual level. And so, to give you a really quick example, with one of my films called Hip Hop Beyond Beats and Rhymes, which is a film that dealt with misogyny and hyperviolence and homophobia in rap music and hip hop culture. One of my biggest challenge in making that film was getting my male audiences to connect and identify with issues that they did not feel were issues that they should be concerned about or care about. So my challenge as a filmmaker was trying to figure out, how do I communicate? How do I speak to my male audience in a way that doesn't make them defensive, doesn't push them away, but invites them into this conversation where they feel like they too have something at stake and should be concerned about things like misogyny and hyperviolence and sexism and homophobia, right? And so there had to be a real game plan associated with that. And one of the things that really helped me in developing that documentary film were my previous years as an activist traveling around the country and having real conversations and real discussions with boys and men about things like masculinity, sexism, violence against women, and homophobia. And as a result of those experiences and listening and understanding what some of the thorny issues were and what made boys and men check out when we had these conversations, all of that dialogue that I experienced in locker rooms and on football fields and in classroom settings, talking to boys and men around the country, I learned how to formulate a strategy to communicate to my audiences in a way where I wasn't just trying to be right as a filmmaker, but that I was being an effective communicator to my audiences in terms of building and creating empathy so that people can personalize the issues that we were discussing, as opposed to dismissing those experiences of girls and women and of gay men and transgendered men and women, but to personalize it in ways where they felt personally invested in helping to eradicate the problems that I was addressing in the film. And I see a very similar relationship with these makers and the content that they are creating to create a more empathetic world, right? A more empathetic society, so that when we have these really complicated conversations around figures like Colin Kaepernick, right? That we don't get this kind of cognitive dissonance where people just can't understand why someone would kneel during the national anthem, right? That we don't get people who check out when they are being challenged about their ideas and their ideology and their perspectives, but they're actually being invited into a conversation where they don't otherize the people who have some very real issues and concerns that they feel need to be addressed. So it's not easy. What these individuals, who are about to come out on the stage to have a conversation, what they do is not easy. And I really commend them for the thoughts and the creativity and the leadership that they have demonstrated in seeking to address these issues in ways that affect millions of people, right? And so that is the job of many of us in this room, is to create transformative work that can get people to grow and to evolve and to make this a more humane world in a very real way, in a way that's not Pollyannish, but in ways that we can become more connected as opposed to separating ourselves and people, retreating to their own silos, right? And I'm sure that you've all seen it. Social media is notorious for this, right? I mean, social media is by definition a place where people can feel very comfortable being at home and disconnecting from other people in a real personal way and sort of separate themselves and get hunkered down in their own ideas, their own perspectives in ways that does not allow them to connect to real human beings because of the barrier of, the kind of space that social media by definition creates, with all of us. So these content creators here who are about to come back onto the stage are going to continue their conversation about how to build empathy, and they're joining us. Can we please give them another round of applause, please? So I want to jump into, is that you? Or is that me? Is that me?
I think it was me.
That was you. Okay.
I'm just going to sit up very straight.
Okay. Well, Jenny, I thought that your game was phenomenal. First of all, how can people access the game? And where can you go and play the game?
Everybody can go play the game right now at playspent.org.
Okay. And so for you, having come out of an experience where you lived a life of poverty as a child, how challenging was it for you to get people to become more empathetic? I mean, you touched on it a little bit, but how challenging was it for you to get people to get outside of their comfort zones and their place where people are being judgy, I think you may have coined that term, judgy. How do you get people to move out of that place and to really empathize with people who are poor?
I think once we settled on doing Spent, it wasn't really challenging at all, because the thing that we realized is that when you've been poor, there are so many weirdly specific things that you experience that if you've never been poor, you wouldn't even think about, right? Like, you wouldn't even think about, like, what you would do if your pet was sick. Most of us were like, oh man, that's going to suck. That's going to eat in my savings when I'm going to do it. You don't think about what it would be like to want to get to work and not have enough gas money. I actually, as part of my research, I pulled it from my life. I pulled from the people who went to Ministries of Durham's life, but then I also did some research. I actually found a Reddit thread that was fascinating that was, you know you're poor when? And what was great is just things that, like, you would never think of. And I remember reading it, and there were things that I was like, oh, I didn't even, yes, that, or yes, that, And I think that's what's so powerful about the game, is it gives you these experiences that are simultaneously, like, super specific, but their specificity is what makes them so believable.
Yeah.
Because they're just things that you couldn't know. And so I think bringing those things you couldn't know to life in a way that feels really personal is a lot more effective than, a 30-second PSA where you have to speak in generalizations.
Yeah. Were there any aspects of the game that you thought would generate empathy, that would create empathy among users or players, but you realized didn't do it? I mean, it's something that seemed really clear to you, but just was not connecting with audiences. And if so, How did you address that?
Yeah, one thing was funny is because I took some of these from my childhood, you have the danger of when you're doing something really personal of putting your own personal stuff in it that you assume everybody's going to relate to. So one of the challenges is your child, you get free lunch. But when I was going to school, and hopefully it's different, but I don't think it is everywhere, like the free lunch kids, like you knew who they were. And I would, all through high school, I just didn't eat lunch because I didn't want to be one of the free lunch kids. So I put a challenge in there that was like, your kid refuses to eat the free lunch. Do you put in $1 a day budget so that they can buy something at school or that you can have food to send them for lunch, or do you let them go hungry? And so many people wrote in and was like, what kind of spoiled kid? I would tell my kid to shut up and suck it up and eat it. So that was one that I was like, we're just going to have to agree to disagree, like hit the button to tell your imaginary kid to suck it up and move on to the next challenge. But there were other, sorry, like we'll see it when your kid actually does it, see what you do. But then there were other challenges where it actually made changes to the game in response to some of the feedback that we got. So for example, you didn't see it up here, but the second challenge that everybody gets is you have to find a place to live. And you can choose to live close to your job, but it costs more money. You can choose to live farther away, but it costs more money in gas. Kind of that idea of like, yeah, you save money on one end, but you pay it on the other. And we, most Americans live in places where even if they live close to their work, they still have to have a car to get to doctor appointments, to get to their kids' school, to get to the grocery store. So many people were like, what about bikes? What about riding a bike? And we had written it based on urban ministries. Durham, we don't have a good public transportation network, and then most people don't. So we actually had to add in the response. Like if you choose to live within 5 miles of your office, we actually had to add in a note that says, you do live close to work, but like 70% of most Americans, you don't live in a place where you have good enough public transportation that you can go without a car. So I was really glad to see some of those angry responses because we were able to go in and clarify things in the game, add challenges, add options and challenges to make it a little bit more palatable to people who had some challenges. But there are always people who are like, when I was 21, I ate beans for 7 months and I am rich now, so people need to get over it. And those people, you just have to say good luck and God bless.
So that they're always going to be, yeah. So they're always going to be challenges reaching people and developing that kind of empathy.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some people who just, there are people you can reach and people who aren't ready yet. Yeah. And there's always going to be that spectrum.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Suhad, you have a really difficult job in terms of creating empathy for a group of people for which there's not a whole lot of empathy, in my opinion. Right? Can you talk a little bit more about some of your personal challenges of really trying to get people who are not seen as fully human to be seen as fully human? And what kind of pushback? I mean, do you receive any pushback for doing this kind of work?
That's a great question. So one of the reasons that our team, for the first 10 years that Just Vision was in existence, we were founded in 2003, one of the primary vehicles for our work has been documentary film. And part of the reason that we chose documentary film at the time of our founding was, first of all, you didn't have social media the way you do today, or alternative media outlets like you're seeing with the rise of things like HuffPost and Politico and so on and so forth. We also knew that given how deeply entrenched key audiences on this issue can be in their personal narratives or biases, that it was important to create an immersive experience for them. That film had the power on one hand to overcome boundaries and barriers, whether you're talking about language or language differences or geographical differences. It also had the power to cut through and force audiences in some ways to immerse themselves in someone else's experience. And then, as I think Jenny sort of really beautifully talked about, they have the choice. Once they know about that narrative, do they learn to incorporate it into their worldview, or do they outright reject it? And on an individual level, and I think you see this through Emil and Muniba's work, is that we've seen time and again that if individuals are educated and we draw awareness to the issues and the people at stake, then they have a choice. They can commit or they could not commit. And if they commit, they could take action or not take action. Now, in addition to that, I think that how people behave in private life, right? So when they see the film Boudreaux, they have a choice. What you do in your living room looks actually quite different than what people do in the public domain. So in addition to trying to reach people and shift their individual perceptions, we really believe that you've got to have a multiple-pronged outreach strategy that's also working on one hand to reach strategic individuals, so influencers, thought leaders, faith communities, educators, and students being some of the leading activists on this issue today. But you've also got to think about how do you shape the social norms or the public macro conversation, which I think is where the Edelman research becomes really interesting, because you want to be able to create a scenario where mainstream media is actually covering these stories on repeat and en masse in the same way that we see our headlines currently being saturated about stories across the Middle East that are quite devastating, violence-filled, and re-entrenching of the very same stereotypes with very little sort of access to the real human consequences of the decisions our foreign policy is making there. So that's the strategy, to try to cut through as much as we can possibly cut through on the macro and the micro individual levels. Now, the other piece, in terms of challenges, there are real challenges, right? And I think that a few years ago, our team started to assess our strategy in Israeli society. And a couple of things was happening. One, the Israeli political sphere was shifting radically to the right. So today, you're seeing some of the most extremist political leaders in power in places like the Ministry of Justice, the Ministry of Communication, the Prime Minister's office, and across the board. And while on an individual level, we felt we were there were some incredible transformations, like young men and women who were rejecting to go to military and becoming conscientious objectors. What happens when those individuals go back into a society that only reinforces the reverse? They're swimming uptide. And so we said to ourselves, we need to figure out if, given the limited resources and the limited capacity of our team, if we can continue to do this work, host screenings and discussions, or is there a better way to do this? And what we came up with after we spoke to editorial boards of the mainstream media outlets in Israeli society, including Channel 2 News and Channel 10, several of whom said to us either there's no space for these kinds of stories, the Israeli public is not interested in stories about occupation and grassroots activists and human and civil rights issues, or they said this is not politically viable. In other words, they didn't have political space to maneuver there. And activists who said, look, we're increasingly marginalized in our community, and we're losing space that we need to regain. We said, well, what would it look like if we actually just created our own news site? And so we launched a Hebrew language news site in Israel. And initially, the same journalists who, there were journalists who were like, look, these stories aren't newsworthy. Your platform is going to tank. 2 years out, we have 1.8 million unique readers, the vast majority of whom are Hebrew-speaking Israelis in Israel. We have now captured the attention of the mainstream media outlets who are turning to us for our investigative reporting. And we are seeing that political leaders have no choice but to pay attention to what we're saying, because we're forcing them to pay attention to what we're saying. So that gives you a sense of some of the kinds of challenges. But one of the things that I think, the burden is on us as storytellers and as activists and as those interested in creating rights-respecting and dignified societies across the board, to continue to think about what are the most strategic and effective interventions that we can make given the challenges that we face. And I hope that gives you a little bit of a sense of what we're playing in.
Well, I mean, it seems like you're doing a really great job, or at least using, what you have in order to, to develop the kind of empathy and compassion to get people to, I guess, look at.
No.
But anyway, it sounds like you're doing a great job. So please continue doing the work. Really appreciate it. So Atit and Jay,
Yeah.
I thought that was a really.
I'm here with the microphone.
I
I couldn't
think
see who
I think
needed
that
it.
maybe, is that
That
mine
was
that dropped out?
unexpected
Is
comment.
that mine?
I have no idea.
Okay. So it's probably mine. Yeah. It's okay. So your piece is very powerful, and
Thank you.
as someone who is deeply invested in police violence, police brutality issues, I can say that I really appreciate the work that you're doing. Um, can you tell me a little bit more about um, some of the hurdles that you continue to face, right? Even though you have a really powerful tool, what are some of the hurdles that you continue to face in getting people beyond some of their implicit and overt biases that they may have or feel to develop the kind of empathy that you're seeking?
Sure. So when we were starting, so the team was non-native English speaker. And we were all international students. So it was definitely, and we presented to our professors that we wanted to do something like this about racial discrimination and police brutality. They were skeptical, definitely, but we said that we don't come with a bias. We don't have anyone who is in the police. We don't have a side, so it'll be we just want to explore if there is if like if we can tell a story in without taking sides or any biases. So that way we started researching a lot, and we learned how people form biases. And it was we had professors who had a family in police. We spoke to journalists who they were in the police force at some time. And we spoke to professors of psychology in the psychology department. And we went through a lot of prototyping to get the story right. um, and even though yeah, even though we tried to be as neutral as as we can, we ended up I think we ended up take having tilting towards one and the other. So it's as a storyteller, it is very difficult for us to be not take sides. So that is one of the that's a difficult hurdle to overcome. uh, Jay, you have anything
Yeah,
to?
and also like virtual reality technology is new technology, so
is.
no one really knows how to tell the story in virtual reality. So we had to figure out, like, for example, I was the director, and I had no space to hide myself because it was 360. So I was, I had to figure out, like, so where can I sit and direct the actors? And also all the actors, they had no idea about technology. So how do I act in this scene? So we had to figure out, like, those kind of small, technical things. So it was definitely very interesting project.
Yeah, we had to hide the mics because again, there should be no equipments in the scene. It is 360. There's no behind the camera. Um and yeah, that was an interesting challenge that we had to solve. We had to hide in the scene as the director, and just to help out the actors. So yeah, we're seeing a lot of live action virtual reality happening over the 1 year since this was produced. So virtual reality, again, a lot of big companies have been investing a lot in the research and development, and we have consumer versions out. So people have access to it. One of the biggest challenge, one of the biggest question that we were asked was, why would anyone? No one has access to this device, that this goggles. Why would they watch it? Rather make a movie, and everyone, you can upload it on YouTube and all other sorts of distribution platform. So but now, like, Oculus Rift is out there, HTC, all the big companies have been putting out consumer version. And it might be normal source of consuming media in the next 5 years.
So you are really on the cutting edge of this new
We like to believe so, yes.
this
Yeah.
new storytelling. Yeah, yeah. So in your clip, it was really clear that people were really affected emotionally by what they had experienced, right?
Yeah.
How do you take people's immediate responses, and this is open to all of you, how do you take people's immediate emotional responses where they may have transformed by your game, by your film, or the work that you do, by your virtual reality piece? How do you get people to move beyond just the emotional, reaction to taking action, to like really doing something, to like really engaging in the communities that are marginalized, right? So that we really make progress on these issues.
Yeah, that how to measure success of your
Do
story,
you
I
have
would
do
say.
you have any measurable tools? Do you have any things that you use, or
We
were
had
you were you were you hoping I didn't ask that question?
a no, it was definitely a challenging metric to find. We definitely we asked people what they felt, but it was a very personal experience. As soon as they removed the headset, they didn't know how to feel. Like they, because at times we didn't tell them what they're going to see inside. We were like just we
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
want to influence your opinion or anything. We had few people who broke down
Yeah,
after seeing,
right.
just because it is a very immersive experience. Again, I'm propagating virtual reality, but it's a very immersive experience, and they had no idea what was coming to them. So um, just getting that that is why we recorded their emotions as soon as they removed it, because that was the most uninfluenced reaction that we could capture.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Add on to that too. I
Sure.
actually have a learning from that. If you look at the last, yeah, if you look at the last frame of spent, it says donate $5 to someone living spent today. Because when it comes down to it, like help is great, awareness is great, a tweet is great, but money is what most of these organizations need to make a difference. And when we first launched Spent, we originally said donate to someone living Spent today. And we got some donations, but we were like, how are we getting like, and this was during the big like peak when it first launched. We're like, how are we getting so many visits and nobody's donating? People seem to be moved. So we took a look back at the end frame, and the end frame originally was like, donate, just donate, volunteer, learn more. And then we're like, you know what? Most of these people are coming from around the world. They're not going to go volunteer or Ministry of Durham. So let's get rid of that. You know what? They probably aren't even going to go learn more. Let's get rid of that. And instead of just saying, hey, donate some money, let's be really specific and let's make the ask really small. I think that's another thing. People are willing to help, but they're only willing to help so much. So we asked for $5, which is not that much money, or you can ask for a tweet, you can ask for a message, make that ask really small. And we found that as soon as we made the action and the request smaller and like digestible and really clear what we were asking for, our ratio of donations just went through the roof. I only wish we'd thought to do that from the beginning.
Very interesting. Yeah.
I'd also just love to add on to that, because I think this is one of the questions that we are always wrestling with, right? And so in MIT's research, you get a glimpse of the sort of metrics that we've been able to capture around how individual perception shifts on this issue also translates into behavioral shifts. So the ICC bid was one. There was a similar donation option that I didn't show was another, also a very significant shift. But the piece that I want to note is that the way in which audiences engage, what their action looks like, takes so many varied forms, right? So for example, for us, it has looked like everything from a journalist who historically had written quite poorly and re-entrenched many stereotypes on this issue, actually reframing the way that they not only think about this, but how they write about it, and turning to us, but not only us, other organizations in the field, because this ecosystem is quite vast, and other organizers, to use them as leads and to verify their stories and to say, hey, what am I missing here now, right? It's also looked like students who said, wait, I had no idea that there was a way for me to do anything about this, who are now organizing on their campuses. Or it looks like donations, or it looks like a political leader, and I'll give you a good example. President Obama, in 2009, when he gave his Cairo speech, he had cited examples of legitimate forms of nonviolent resistance all over the Arab world, and yet he condemned Palestinians for not adopting nonviolent strategies. Now, not only was that a false statement and completely inaccurate, shouldn't be coming out of a president's mouth, but what happened, we ended up sitting down with him a couple of years later, and we put Budris in his hands, and we said, look, like, you actually missed a step here. You missed a beat, and you reinforced a really problematic stereotype in condemning Palestinians on this. And we want you to start not only paying attention to it, but to start citing it, right? And this is a very, very incremental, very, very tiny shift, and surely US foreign policy is deeply, deeply problematic in the Middle East today. But they actually added that into the speech when he went to Jerusalem and to the Muqatta in Ramallah that following trip. So that's, one of the things that we're thinking about constantly is what is the quality of the stories that are being put out there, not just the numerics, because so often the numerics can be deceiving. We're thinking about a lot of the anecdotal stories from the young Israeli who's becoming a conscientious objector, to the young Palestinian who becomes a community organizer and leader in their community, to the journalists, and so on and so forth. But I just want to share that I think that there's, and I also want to just share that there's so many organizations that are working on this that we also, at Just Vision at least, we try to think about what is our role in this, right? Can we possibly do everything at once? And there are good people who are equipped to mobilize in masses, take action, like Jewish Voice for Peace, and a plethora of organizations that we try to funnel folks into so that they can actually get involved and be part of a community after they've had some kind of change.
So your comments made me think about, the idea of power, who has power, who doesn't have power, and what happens when you create or when you fill the empathy gap, right? You're actually pushing people to either give up some of their privilege, right? And they're therefore giving up some of their power, right? So how can you talk a little bit about how creating empathy kind of could potentially shift the balance of power in ways that empower the people who should be more empowered? I mean, people who are typically disengaged or marginalized or disconnected. How can creating empathy among viewers and participants in your game and et cetera, how can that actually shift power?
I think it can just change the way people look at things. Like, for example, another challenge I didn't share was there's a challenge where your window gets broken and you ask your landlord to fix it and your landlord says no. And so many people commented on these forums like, what the hell, that's illegal. And there's actually, it comes up, we added something afterwards, because it didn't cross my mind that people would not believe that your landlord could say no and you couldn't do anything about it. Like, having grown up in houses where there was a hole in the living room floor and you just knew that that was what you had to live with, like, I had no idea that people would not know that you could be in that situation, that your landlord had that kind of power, that you couldn't just call a lawyer. Like, people would say, like, why don't they call a lawyer? And we actually added in some options where it was try to find a lawyer, and it was like, guess what? It costs $350 for a consultation. So I think putting people on kind of the other side of that table and making them realize that, like, all these laws and rules and things that we assume to be the case, just like with the Flint story earlier, people are so shocked because we have this assumption that the government will take care of us. Or as like a white woman, I have the assumption, I grew up thinking, if you're in trouble, go see a police officer because they're the good guys. I didn't have to grow up in a place where I had to think about how am I going to be with this police officer because they might hurt me. And so I think so much of empathy is kind of flipping that lens and having someone look at it and realize that the things that you thought were the rules are only the rules because of where you stand. That when you go on the other side of the board game now, when you go on the other side of the field, like, all of a sudden the rules are different. And just making you experience that, I think, is what's so powerful.
And I guess I would look at it also to add on to Jenny's comment, also on the flip side of this, right? So I'm a queer woman. There's a real thing called National Coming Out Day. And the reason that coming out is such a powerful act is, on one hand, because it forces those who are around you and those who love you and those who know you to reckon with that identity and to actually check their assumptions and to check their biases. It does another amazing thing, though. It also encourages other folks who are not out or are living in fear, are concerned for their safety, to also come out, right? And I see this all the time on Israel-Palestine as well, right? Like there is power in numbers, and I think it's one of the ironies in what you're sharing, Jenny, is that so many poor communities have actually been the backbone of the largest social movements in America and around the world. And there's great agency that these communities that are often depicted as incapable, victims, or violent and dehumanized actually take on every single day in various forms. And so part of, I think, the creation of empathy, it's not only just for audiences who would assume an othering of someone, but it's also, there is power in having our stories told accurately and told so that we have role models and inspiration and success stories to look up to look forward to learn from, and to not only replicate, but be able to adapt to our current conditions. And there's real strength in that.
Absolutely. This is going to be my last question, but it's going to be preceded by a comment. So I'm working on this film about hazing, and I have been both a victim and a perpetrator of hazing. And this film is deeply personal for me that I'm working on. And since I've been working on the film, I've been able to talk to many victims of hazing, family members, moms who have lost their children, husbands who have lost their wives, cousins who have lost a dear loved one. And watching the material and hearing the stories has taken me to a place where I so completely empathize with anyone who has experienced hazing, even much more than when I started working on the project. And so I'm curious to know from each of you, how have you been personally transformed by the work that you have created?
Great question. So I'll just share one that's top of mind for me, because I've been thinking a lot about this concept of burnout and what sustainability looks like. Yeah, you're nodding your head. Lots of resonates. You feel me? So, when I first got involved...
I feel you. I feel you.
So, when I first got involved in the work that I do at Just Vision, I was driven by the belief in stories and a sort of gravity towards stories. And I wanted the stories that I knew existed in my community and in communities across Israeli and Palestinian society to get out into the world. Because as a college student, I remember trying my hardest, looking through textbooks, going to professors, trying to understand my father's history, and realizing that there was very little that actually resonated or reflected my experience of it. Now, today, several years later, the thing that gets me out of bed every morning is surely that commitment to justice and to wanting these stories out and to building rights-respecting societies. But it's actually the people that I do it with that get me out of bed every morning. It's because I know that there's someone, if I'm down, someone is going to be pulling me right back up. And the transformative aspect for me of the work that we do at Just Vision is surely about seeing the different audiences and how they're engaging, and every audience is miraculously so different. But it's also what's happening behind the scenes when we're interviewing our protagonists. We're working on a new film now of women from the Palestinian women from the First Intifada who've played crucial leadership roles. And they have never told their story, 30 years later, have never told their story to anybody, in many cases, not even their own children. And as we started interviewing them, one of the women would ask us, who else are you interviewing? And we're like, we're interviewing so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. And they're all like, oh, no way, I haven't seen her in 25 years. Can we see each other? Can we actually do this together? And so, we became facilitators of their reconnections. And, even if this film flops, and I hope it doesn't,
It's
and
not gonna flop.
we're building every
Don't even
strategy
put that out
that
into
we
the
can
universe.
every strategy that we can possibly build out, building out the outreach campaign, making sure it's a powerful, emotional, compelling story. There's something that will never be taken away from that experience. The rekindling of those relationships, this sort of agency and the transformation I was seeing in those women transforming myself and sort of re-inspiring and reigniting me was amazing.
for me, it's so funny. You said National Coming Out Day, and that really made me think of Spent, because for me, that's kind of what Spent was for me. That sounds a little bit weird, but growing up in poverty, like, I had a lot of shame. I had so much shame about being poor. I don't know exactly where it came from, but it was there. You know, I was really embarrassed. I was the first person in my family to go to college, and when I got there, I just kind of just like, it was almost like passing is what I call it. That's a lot what it was like. I remember I worked.
Can you explain what that means for people who may not know?
Passing is basically when you're of one group and are able to pass as another. So people who are maybe of African American origin who look white and are able to present as white is usually the, I think, context in which it's usually used. So when I got to college, I did everything I could to pass as somebody who wasn't poor. And I remember one summer I worked at a program for at-risk youth, and this girl came up to me. She goes, "Jenny, what the hell do you know? You're just a dumb rich bitch." And there was a part of me that was like, how dare she? And there was a part of me, like, whether or not I want to admit it, that was like, yes, I did it. So for me, like, coming out and doing Spent was really scary, because it wasn't just like being like, okay, guys, guess what? I was poor. It was like putting my life out there and turning it into something that I put in front of millions of people. But it was so powerful. And I remember my sister called me. I sent it to my sister. And there's nobody who knows what your life is like more than your siblings, right? So sending it to my sister was a huge deal. You know, my mom died when she was 46 years old of heart disease. She didn't have health insurance. And when you don't have health insurance in this country, you just die. Like, there's nothing. So sending it to my sister was such a big deal, because this was like our life. This was our mother. This was like the struggles and the creativity. I mean, that's the thing you don't realize about being poor, is you have to be so creative to be able to make ends meet. You have to be so strong. So I was really scared that I was going to get it wrong. And I sent it to my sister, and my sister called me, and she was sobbing on the phone. And I was like, "Are you okay?" I was like, "Oh God, I messed up." And she was like, "I just looked at my husband and I pointed at the screen." She's like, "I couldn't even talk. I just pointed at the screen." And I was like, it's our life. So for me, it was this, almost like this coming out. It was kind of laying bare of something that I had spent 30 years of my life pretending hadn't happened. So yeah, it was kind of long-winded, sorry.
Very well stated, and thank you so much for sharing that. Jay, Atit, do you have any quick stories of transformation in your own personal lives?
Sure. Well, I guess Jay would also agree with me. Coming from a different country into the U.S. and getting to work on this project helped us understand the deep, the different the issues of this country and how the culture is. It was definitely an humbling experience. Yes.
Jay,
Yeah.
Suhad, Jenny, thank you so very, very much for helping to transform our culture through your work. We really appreciate it. Can you please give them another round of applause?
Thank you.
They were outstanding. Thank you so much.